We have all gone through difficult times at some point. Due to different circumstances in life, we have left our homeland to a distant and unknown land without knowing what awaits us ahead. During this time, we have experienced anguish and fear, and in the worst of cases, many have felt abandoned. But the truth is that even if everyone abandons us, God will never abandon us. Approximately 2,600 years ago, a young Jew was taken captive in an invasion by the Babylonian Empire. But although most people taken into captivity were destined for a miserable life of slavery, God had a special plan for this character whose name is Daniel. Today, dear listener, we want to present to you the fascinating life of this great prophet God. Many of us have longed for God to show himself with such power as to cause awe in the hearts of those who doubt. We've all wanted it, and this is exactly what happens in Daniel. The miraculous power and amazing majesty of God is reflected through incredible rescues and extraordinary predictions. The government of God in the affairs of humanity, both in the present and in the future, is presented. He is truly the king over all kings, and his kingdom will have no end. Before delving into this topic, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell so that YouTube notifies you every time we publish a new video. Let's start. Daniel, whose name means God is my judge, was a prominent Jewish prophet who lived during the 7th and 6th centuries before our era. He grew up in Judah, the kingdom where Jerusalem and the Jewish temple were. Daniel's life changed radically at the age of 17. Raised as a member of the Jewish nobility, this Hebrew teenager was captured and taken captive to the country of Babylon, where King Nebuchadnezzar ruled when his city, Jerusalem, was conquered. Let's read verses 1 and 2 of chapter 1 of Daniel. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave into his hands Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and part of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasure house of his God. Dear listeners, as we see, the book begins by explaining some details about the historical background of this period. The text places us in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. This Jehoiakim was the eldest son of Josiah, a godly king who had brought important spiritual renewal to the country. But his son Joachim was totally different from him. He was an unfaithful and foolish man. He despised with all his might the prophets who spoke to him from the Lord, and even burned the scroll that Jeremiah gave him through Baruch, and in which were all the prophecies that God had spoken through the prophet during the last few years. This wicked king, lacking any fear of God, had led Judah to its spiritual ruin and finally its captivity as well. It was during his reign that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, first came against Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar came against Jerusalem because the Pharaoh of Egypt invaded Babylon. In response, the young prince Nebuchadnezzar defeated the Egyptians at Carchemish. Then he pursued the escaping army to Sinai, and on the way or back, he subjugated Jerusalem, who had been loyal to the Pharaoh of Egypt. This happened in the year 605 before Christ, and it was the first, but not the last meeting between Nebuchadnezzar and Jehoiakim. There would be other invasions later. This specific attack mentioned in Daniel is documented by the Babylonian Chronicle, a collection of tablets discovered around 1887 and kept in a British museum. The presence of Nebuchadnezzar in the year 605 before Christ. In Judah, it is documented and is clarified in these tables. Now, this date is very important for 2 reasons. First of all, it was in this first captivity that Daniel and his friends were taken to Babylon. And secondly, the date would serve to mark the 70 years that the Jews would remain captive in Babylon, as Jeremiah had prophesied. So God used the wicked Babylonians as instruments of judgment on his people Israel. Let's continue reading verse 3 to 7. And the king told Ashpenaz, chief of his eunuchs, to bring of the children of Israel, of the royal line of princes, boys in whom there was no blemish, of good appearance, taught in all wisdom, wise in knowledge and of good understanding, and fit to be in the king's palace, and to teach them the letters and the language of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a portion for each day, from the king's provision of food, and from the wine that he drank, and that he would raise them for 3 years, so that at the end of them they would appear before the king. Among these were Daniel, Ananias, Mishael, and Azariah, of the children of Judah. To these the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He named Daniel, Belteshazzar, to Ananias, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. Throughout the book, we will see the incredible influence that Daniel and his friends had on the Babylonian Empire, and also on the Persian one. But at the beginning of our story, there was nothing to suggest that this could happen. Daniel and his companions were young Jews, probably still teenagers, who were living in Judah under the reign of Jehoiakim, when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, conquered the country and took them captive. How sad that being so young, they should have already witnessed the cruelty of the Babylonian armies breaking into their homes, killing, and taking everything that seemed valuable to them. They themselves were one of those objects that they had reserved because they thought they might be useful to them in the future. But we can imagine the terrible consequences that all those scenes must have left on their minds and hearts. How could they live in peace for the rest of their lives with those who had killed their loved ones and destroyed everything they loved? Often, many of the things that happen to us are the consequence of our bad decisions, but neither Daniel nor his friends had been the cause of this national tragedy. They were some of the many young people who suffered the consequences of Jehoiakim's impious government. Furthermore, as verse 3 says, these young men were of the royal line of princes. Everything suggested that their life was going to be full of comforts and luxuries in the court of Judah, but now they were captives of a foreign power. Perhaps for a time they had hoped that this situation would be temporary, but the continued rebellions of the kings of Israel caused Nebuchadnezzar to completely destroy them. Daniel and his friends would see the new waves of prisoners arriving in Babylon and would hear the news of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. There was nothing to wait for. Now, when the Jews arrived in Babylon, the king's officials were ordered to select some of them to serve in his administration. We must not forget that with each new country that Nebuchadnezzar conquered, he formed a great empire for which he had to organize a solid administration that could understand the languages and customs of those nations he was annexing. For this reason, the king commissioned a careful selection in order to find some young people who were of the royal lineage of princes, in whom there was no blemish, of good appearance, taught in all wisdom, wise in knowledge and of good understanding, and suitable to be in the king's palace. Ashpenaz, chief of the court officials, was in charge of supervising this selection in which, among others, Daniel and his 3 friends were chosen. This was prophesied in Isaiah chapter 39 verse 7, where it says, "Some of your children will be taken into exile. They will make them eunuchs who will serve in the palace of the king of Babylon." This prophecy leads some to think that Daniel and his companions were made eunuchs at that time, since Ashpenaz was the chief of the eunuchs. This was a common practice in the ancient Near East, which was intended to make young people more docile and not be distracted by other matters, but rather to become entirely occupied with studying and the tasks assigned to them. But in any case, it was a terrible humiliation that deprived them of having children and also of the legitimate joys of marriage. This was because their entire life would have to be dedicated to that king who had conquered them by force of arms. Now, after this, Daniel and his friends are trained in the school of the king of Babylon. It was a process of intensive training in the best Chaldean schools that would last 3 years, and in which they would have to learn the letters and the language of the Chaldeans. We assume that this educational program would also include studies in mathematics, law, religion, architecture, astronomy, and astrology. Of course, with this training, they wanted to make them useful officials in Nebuchadnezzar's government. but they also wanted to end any trace of their own Jewish culture and religion. So, since their names honored Jehovah the God of Israel, the chief eunuch decided to change them. The name Daniel, which means God is my judge, was changed to Belteshazzar, which means Prince of Bel. The name Ananias, which means beloved of the Lord, was changed to Shadrach, which probably reflects the idea that he was God-fearing. The name Mishael, which means who is like God, was changed to Meshach, which probably has the idea of someone who is of little value. The name Azariah, which means the Lord is my help, was changed to Abednego, which means servant of Nebo, in reference to the god Nebo. Although it is difficult to know the precise meaning of the new names, what was clear is that Ashpenaz was determined to erase from the court of Babylon any testimony of the name of the God of Israel. And with their new names, he wanted to remind them of their duty to submit to the gods of Babylon. This was a total indoctrination effort in order to make these young Hebrews leave behind their God and Hebrew culture. Dear listeners, Satan uses a similar strategy against believers today, wanting to indoctrinate them into the world system. Satan wants us to, first of all, let's identify ourselves, name, in reference to the world. Secondly, feed ourselves with what the world offers. Thirdly, educate ourselves in the ways of the world. Now, after all that process aimed at erasing from them any sign of identity of their previous nation and religion, they were prepared to live and serve in the presence of the king as true Babylonians. There, lost in the middle of a great empire like the Babylonian, surrounded by a bunch of other young people from different ethnic minorities, and being constantly watched, there was little they could do to resist. Part of the training of the young men who would train in the king's service required them to undergo 3 years of preparation, and they were fed with portions of the food and wine that were served to the king. Out of fear of Jehovah, Daniel and his friends did not want to eat the food they served to others and convinced their superiors to only give him legumes to eat for 10 days. At the end of that time, these young people were found to be healthier than those who ate regular food, and also possessed superior knowledge in all kinds of wisdom and sciences. In particular, Daniel had the gift of interpreting dreams and visions. This shows that purity of heart and fidelity to God come before the illustration of the divine mysteries. Daniel would later receive a great revelation, but now he simply showed himself to be a dedicated follower of God. Dear listeners, Daniel and his friends show us that an internal conviction can overcome any external pressure. No one would dare argue that we live in a world of compromise. In fact, commitment is often considered a virtue. He is diplomatic and reasonable. On the other hand, those who cling to their integrity are seen as harsh, extremist, and insensitive to the common good. You can understand why the world thinks that way, but shouldn't Christians be different? Unfortunately, many believers worry about what people will think, say, or do if they take a stand on divine principles. So then, they compromise their convictions or keep them hidden. If you are one of those faint-hearted Christians, or if you know someone who is, I would like to encourage you to take a lesson from the life of Daniel and his friends, 4 men with guts. Now in chapter 2 of Daniel, we see that Nebuchadnezzar was losing sleep because he had had a series of nightmares. The king consulted with all his magicians, astrologers, fortune tellers, and sorcerers, but none of them could help the king. This angered Nebuchadnezzar so much that he ordered the execution of all the wise men in the nation. It turns out that Daniel and his friends were considered among the wise, and the 4 were under threat of death. When Daniel learned of the situation, he agreed with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to ask God for help regarding the situation. Miraculously, God responds by revealing the meaning of dreams to Daniel, and he manages to appear before the king with this information. With God's help, Daniel was able to describe the dream to Nebuchadnezzar and explain its meaning. This causes the king to humble himself and recognize the greatness of Daniel's God. Nebuchadnezzar was obviously impressed. He was not in the habit of showing such respect to any person, especially a foreign slave who was about to be executed with the rest of the wise men. Nebuchadnezzar knew that it was not Daniel himself who revealed these things, but rather Daniel's God revealed them through him. Daniel wanted the glory to go to God, and so it was. Daniel not only spared his life, but he was promoted to a great position, and he made sure his friends were promoted too. It was fitting that Daniel's friends shared his progress, because they accomplished much of the victory through their prayers. In this way, these young Jews who had been deported to Babylon as war captives rose to the highest positions of authority within the Babylonian Empire. This was without a doubt a miracle. Daniel himself was still very young, and yet he was made leader of all the wise men of the kingdom, men much older than he, no doubt. God once again rewarded his faithfulness, and we are sure that from their new position, these young people would serve as mediators before the king on behalf of the other exiles of Judah. Now we have to ask ourselves if Nebuchadnezzar's attitude implied an authentic conversion. And it is difficult to know, but everything seems to indicate that it was not like that. Since sometime later, Nebuchadnezzar has another dream and consults Daniel again. This time, the dream revealed the condemnation that God would send to the king, and which was fulfilled just as Daniel interpreted it. Nebuchadnezzar was expelled and went mad until he had to recognize that the Most High rules the kingdom of men, and that he gives it to whomever he wants and appoints over it the lowest of men. Dear listeners, we have a complete video about the madness of Nebuchadnezzar. We will be leaving the link of the video in the description so you can see it. Now, the events recorded in the first 4 chapters of Daniel have to do with the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, who was the one who extended and unified the Babylonian Empire and took it to its greatest splendor. After having reigned for 43 years, he died in the year 562 before Christ. Succeeding him on the throne was his son Evil-Merodach, who ruled for 2 years until he was murdered by his brother-in-law Neriglissar, or Nergal-Sarezer, who in turn occupied the throne for the next 4 years. Upon his death, he was succeeded by his young son Labashi-Marduk, who only reigned for a few months, as he was assassinated and replaced by Nabonidus, who ruled 17 years from 556 to 539 before Christ. He worked hard to restore the glory that Babylon had achieved under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, which led to him being absent from the capital for long periods. Belshazzar was his eldest son and was appointed co-regent by his father. For this reason he is called king in Daniel chapter 5 verse 1, since he exercised royal authority even though Nabonidus had the throne. In light of all this data, we can conclude that between chapters 4 and 5 of Daniel, there is a period of about 23 years in which several kings succeeded one another on the throne. This was a time marked by gradual deterioration, internal conflicts, intrigues, and assassinations. Meanwhile, Cyrus, the great king of the Median-Persian Empire, was approaching the region with the intention of conquering the Babylonian Empire. Daniel chapter 5 describes the night before Cyrus entered Babylon. The Babylonian king had a party in the palace, where they used utensils acquired from Jehovah's temple in Jerusalem during the invasion. Suddenly a hand appeared writing something on the wall. The king, alarmed, summons the magicians and fortune-tellers to decipher what he says. No one could, and finally they called Daniel. At this time, almost 70 years had passed since Daniel and his companions had been taken captive to Babylon. Daniel had to be an old man between 80 and 85 years old. By that time, most would not even know him anymore. It was on the queen's recommendation that he was sent for. Then the king repeated to Daniel what he had heard from the queen and offered him the same generous rewards that he had previously promised to the wise men if he could read and interpret the strange writing on the wall. Despite his advanced age, Daniel remained faithful to God and kept his spiritual gifts intact, showing the same dignity and courage that had characterized him in his youth. Let's notice the answer that Daniel gave to the king. Let's read verse 17 of chapter 5 of Daniel. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to others. I will read the writing to the king and give him the interpretation." Daniel somewhat harshly rejected the king's offer because he knew that the Babylonian kingdom had come to an end. This monarch, like everyone, would be used to receiving adulation and buying the favors of others, but the servant of God was not going to lend himself to that. His long ministry had been characterized by fidelity and dedication to God, as well as disinterest in material things. So, he would render this service to the king as he had always done, not for the personal gain he hoped to obtain in return, but as a service to the Most High God who had sent him. Daniel explained God's displeasure with Belshazzar, expressed in the phrases on the wall. He also communicates the punishment that God would send upon the king. That same night, Belshazzar died. The defeat of Babylon at the hands of the Medo-Persians, previously announced by God, serves as a demonstration that God is in control of human history. He has the last word in this world. Now, although there was a change from one empire to another, we still find Daniel in the position of prime minister under Darius the Mede. Let's read verses 1 and 2 of chapter 6 of Daniel. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom to rule throughout the kingdom, and over them 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps gave account, so that the king would not be harmed. We are told that Darius had 120 princes or sub-governors who shared responsibility and leadership with him. Over this group, Darius appointed 3 presidents or administrators who served as liaison or coordination officials between the princes and the king. There was therefore a distribution of responsibility and government. We were told that these 3 presidents, and Daniel was one of them, held their office so that the king's interests would not be affected. Now, this suggests that presidents or administrators had to prevent princes from stealing or undermining the king's power in any way. Among these 3 administrators, Daniel was in first place, and we estimate that he was about 80 years old at that time. Now, Daniel not only had seniority, but he also had superiority and an extraordinary spirit. This indicates that Daniel was a man filled with the Spirit. And the king had such confidence in him that he placed him immediately after himself in the position of power, and this made him the object of attacks. The governors and satraps were looking for an opportunity to accuse Daniel regarding the kingdom, but they could find no occasion or fault, because he was faithful, and no vice or fault was found in him. Dear listener, this is something that certainly always happens. When you stand out for being first in some social circles, in politics, at school, or in the business world, you will be noticed by those who are jealous. If you have a flaw in your life, or if you have an Achilles heel, a sensitive point where you can be hurt, those who feel jealous will try to discover that weak point and could use it against you. Now Daniel was backed by a remarkable personal life. These men could find nothing in this man's character or his past life that they could take advantage of to harm him. Today, a child of God has to live in such a way that any accusation that will inevitably be leveled against him is not true. You can't stop people from talking about you, but you can live in such a way that what other people say is a lie when they make comments. The Apostle Paul demanded the following from all believers in his letter to the Philippians, chapter 2, verse 15, so that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of an evil and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. And in chapter 24 of the book of Acts, verse 16, we read Paul's personal testimony. He says like this, "And for this reason I always try to have a conscience without offense before God and before men." In other words, Paul could lie down at night and sleep, and had no conscience to trouble him. That would have to be true of every believer. Someone has said that a conscience is something that only a good person can enjoy. Now, the men who rose up against Daniel, finding nothing wrong, devised another plan to make Daniel fall. Let's read verse 5 of chapter 6 of Daniel. Then the men said, "We will not find any occasion against this Daniel to accuse him, unless we find it against him in relation to the law of his God." These men knew Daniel well. They knew that he could not fall into iniquity, but they also knew that he would be faithful to his God in all circumstances. Every Christian should consider whether others might say the same about them. A certain author said, The world may not know the details of doctrine or the intimacy of worshiping God, but they can point out a bad temper, selfishness, quarrels, and dishonesty when they see it. The world is a very poor critic of my Christianity, but it is a very sufficient one of my conduct. Now, if Daniel's enemies knew him, they also knew Darius. They knew they could appeal to Darius's pride and his desire for a united kingdom. They convinced Darius to order that no one in the kingdom pray to any god or person other than the king. They did this knowing that Daniel would never do that, and that's how it was. When Daniel knew that the edict had been signed, he entered his house, and having opened the windows of his chamber facing Jerusalem, he knelt 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he used to do before. Daniel was confronted with a test of loyalties. He was a loyal subject of his king, but he knew that the King of Kings deserved greater loyalty. It is not difficult to see why people please men. It seems as if people have the power to hire us or fire us, to break our hearts, to slander us, to make our lives a misery. The power to obey God and stand firm for Him comes from an established understanding that God is actually in control. Daniel did not let the decree change his actions one way or another. He prayed neither more nor less. He simply continued his excellent prayer life. Spurgeon said, "He prayed 3 times a day, knowing that, although a little prayer is good, a lot of prayer is much better." We also remember that Daniel was one of 3 rulers over an empire, and he still had time to pray. This does not tell us how often he prayed, but how often he was in a prayer posture. He would no doubt pray 300 times a day if necessary. His heart was always doing business with the heavens, but he prayed formally 3 times a day. Now his political enemies had no difficulty in finding Daniel praying to God, so without any delay they accused him before the king. Dario must have been very surprised by this fact, and it was surely then that he realized how he had been used by them. Those men cared neither about the honor of the king nor about compliance with the law. Their only objective was to destroy the prophet of God. Dario could then see the falsehood of their hearts, but it was too late. The edict had been signed and could not be revoked. The king was very sorry for what he had done. He was sorry for having authorized an edict like that, motivated solely by his vanity. But there was no solution. Daniel was sentenced and thrown into the lion's den, although the king was fully convinced of his innocence. The pit into which Daniel was cast would have been dug into the ground deep enough so that the lions could not jump out of it. We assume it would also have a low wall around the edge for protection. It also had an opening on which a stone was placed, which in turn was sealed with the king's ring. How sad it is to imagine Daniel, a venerable and just man, being taken as the vilest of evildoers to be devoured by beasts just for praying to his God. The first thing that surprises us about his execution is that a fall from that height did not kill an old man like Daniel, but it was even more extraordinary that those hungry lions did not devour the prophet. And if all this were not amazing enough, we still have to hear what the king said to Daniel when he was going to be thrown into the pit. "May your God, whom you continually serve, deliver you." Let's think carefully about this. On the one hand, Dario's interest in Daniel is surprising. There is no doubt that he had been strongly impacted by his character and the faith he had in his God. Even a pagan king like him could see the difference between Daniel's God and the other gods. But what catches our attention the most is that the king himself tells the prophet to pray to his God to free him, when a few days before he had signed a decree prohibiting doing such a thing. He was clearly accepting that he himself was completely incapable of meeting the requests of his subjects. Although Darius was a pagan king, there was still some sensitivity in his heart that allowed him to distinguish between justice and injustice. And in those moments he had no doubt that what he had just done to Daniel was a terrible injustice. So he went to his palace and could not sleep that night. We assume that he would also be angry for having allowed himself to be manipulated in this way by his subjects. He was so sad that he fasted and did not want party instruments to be brought to him. After a sleepless night, the king got up early in the morning and went to the lion's den. This detail is curious, because it would be logical that those hungry lions would have devoured Daniel. But it seems that the king retained the hope that he had been protected by the God whom he served. That is, he hoped and desired a miracle. And coming to the den, he called out to Daniel with a sad voice and said to him, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Then Daniel answered the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel who closed the mouth of the lions so that they would not harm me, because before him I was found innocent. And even before you, O king, I have done nothing wrong." In Daniel, there are no words of reproach, nor of bitterness or revenge. On the contrary, the prophet seemed happy. After all, he had spent the night with the angel of the Lord. Daniel was saved by his faith, as Hebrews chapter 11 verse 33 explains. By faith these people conquered kingdoms, ruled justly, and received what God had promised them. They closed the mouths of lions. Dear listeners, once again the book of Daniel shows us that God takes care of those who trust in him. Even the king himself was filled with joy to see Daniel unharmed, which shows the high esteem in which the king held him. He immediately ordered it to be taken out of the pit and examined. Daniel was not seeking revenge, but Dario was not willing to leave the matter at that. So he gave orders, and those men who had accused Daniel were brought in. And they, their children, and their wives were thrown into the lion's den, and they had not yet reached the bottom of the den when the lions seized them and broke all their bones. This was obviously severe, but it was also in keeping with ancient customs among the Persians. An ancient writer named Ammianus Marcellinus wrote of the Persians, "The laws among them are formidable, by which, because of the fault of one, the whole family perished." Now, there is no doubt that Darius was deeply impressed by the God of Daniel. He had no doubt about the miracle that occurred. And that is why we notice an astonishing change in him. He who had previously demanded to be treated as a god now promulgates a new edict so that all the subjects of his kingdom fear and tremble before the presence of the God of Daniel. This reminds us of Nebuchadnezzar's earlier edicts. Although it may not imply personal faith on Dario's part, it does express an overwhelming impression of the power of Daniel's God. Let us notice that it bears witness to the God of Daniel. Let us read verses 26 and 28. "This ordinance is placed on my behalf, that in all the dominion of my kingdom everyone should fear and tremble at the presence of the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and remains forever, and his kingdom will never be destroyed, and his dominion will endure to the end. He saves and delivers, and works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions, and this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and during the reign of Cyrus the Persian." Daniel had good reason to be satisfied. On the one hand, he had been delivered from the lions, but above all, because God had once again been exalted by his faithful testimony. Can there be anything that produces more joy in the believer than this? Finally, Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and during the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Despite the opposition of the governors and satraps, Daniel prospered during the years he lived during the reigns of Darius and Cyrus. Why is this verse here? To show that Daniel continued until the end of Israel's captivity. He was taken captive in the year 605 before Christ and continued until the first year of King Cyrus. Probably, it was he who led King Cyrus to the vision of the rebuilding of the temple. Daniel was a conqueror, as he remained faithful to the Lord and his purpose in the 70 years of captivity, from the beginning to the order for the restoration of the temple. There are no biblical testimonies about Daniel's death, and later traditions do not clarify whether he returned to the territory of Judea or remained in Mesopotamia. But the latter seems the safest. Since he was still alive during the reign of Cyrus, which begins in Babylon in the year 539, before Christ, it is possible that he reached a centenary of age. His death is placed, then, between the third year of the Persian sovereign, that is, around 536 and 530 before Christ, when Cyrus himself dies. since his presence is not mentioned in the time of Cambyses. Dear listeners, the book of Daniel follows a familiar pattern. God's people remain firm in their convictions. God honors and protects them, and the testimony of God's work makes the wicked see and speak of the greatness of God. The book of Daniel is divided into two sections. In the first, chapters 1 through 6, Daniel serves as an interpreter of dreams and becomes a trusted royal advisor. Due to his impeccable integrity, he advised kings and influenced the greatest rulers in both empires for a period of more than 70 years. The Babylonian and the Medo-Persian. Daniel and his friends had a powerful impact on the pagan society around them by loving and trusting God in a hostile environment. In the second section, covering chapters 7 through 12, Daniel is a dreamer of dreams. The visions he saw detail some of the most incredible predictions in Scripture. God showed him a great episode in history, highlighting the rise and fall of the Babylonian, Medo-Persian, Greek, and Roman kingdoms. Most of these prophecies culminate with the kingdom of God breaking into the kingdom of men with the coming of the Messiah. This unique view of history from the perspective of God's throne fills the reader with great hope and anticipation of the eternal reign of the King of Kings, our Lord Jesus Christ. In this way, we are reaching the end of the video. We appreciate your company and hope to see you in our next video.